In 1972, St. Louis Cardinals catcher Ted Simmons took a stand, and the results are still being felt to this day. By demanding he be paid what he was truly worth, rather than accepting the value dictated by team ownership, he transferred the power from the owners to the players. Every player who has ever signed a huge contract worth millions truly owes a debt of gratitude to Simmons. Playing in an era with many great catchers, Simmons carved out his place in that pantheon by hitting for average with decent power, as well as being a player who could be counted on to always be in the lineup, despite the physical demands of the most injury-prone position on the field. But his legacy is more than being one of the best to ever don the tools of ignorance. Today, he's remembered for his bold decision to play an entire season without a contract. That single decision emphasized his value as a player and reminded the ownership that players were more than interchangeable parts who could be paid whatever the owners decided they were worth. In the 1970s, MLB players were still bound to ownership by something called the reserve clause. In a nutshell, the reserve clause meant that the players had to take whatever salary was offered. They could not change teams or hold out for a better deal. The reserve clause basically meant when it came to contracts, it was my way of the highway. But in the 70s, players began to chip away, and in 1975, the first cracks appeared with a court case that was ruled in favor of pitchers Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally. The so-called Seitz decision, named for arbitrator Peter Seitz, declared that players became free agents upon playing 1 year for their team without a contract. But 3 years before that decision, Ted Simmons engaged in a holdout that, up to this point, would have been unthinkable. Amid this evolving labor landscape, players started to assert themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable in previous eras. Ted Simmons' decision to play the 1972 season without a contract was the opening shot in a battle between the owners, who enjoyed the benefits of the current system, and the players who were seeking fair compensation for their contribution to the owner's bottom line. By 1972, Ted Simmons, though still just 22 years old, had established himself as one of the most promising young players in baseball. He was a true rarity, a switch-hitting catcher who hit for both power and average. He knew he was a crucial part of the Cardinals' future and wanted to be paid like it. But brewing magnate and team owner Gussie Busch had other ideas. Simmons was coming off a 1971 season that had seen him hit .304 with 7 home runs and 77 RBIs. He made $25,000 that year and was looking for an increase of $10,000. But Gussie Busch didn't see it that way. Instead of $35,000, the Budweiser boss countered with $25,000, the same amount Ted had made the previous year. This was a common practice at the time because players had no recourse. That's when Simmons made the bold decision to reject their contract offer and play the 1972 season without a signed agreement. This was a risky move for a couple of reasons. First, Simmons had no financial security in case of injury. Secondly, he knew the owners had substantial PR clout, and he not only risked alienating team management, but he also might see the fans turn against him. It wasn't an easy decision for Ted, but he was a man with integrity and believed very strongly in fairness. He simply believed that his performance on the field should dictate his value, and the Cardinals were underestimating his worth. By drawing a line in the sand, Simmons hoped to not only secure a fair contract for himself, but also challenge the reserve clause. With no recourse, the players could be exploited and were basically the property of their team. Tuning out the distractions, Simmons had the best year of his career so far, still hitting over .300, increasing his RBI total, and more than doubling the number of homers hit in the previous season. If Busch was hoping for a drop in production to justify his tight-fisted stance, he was sorely disappointed. Instead, Ted solidified his reputation as one of the game's premier catchers. Adding to the pressure on Busch was the fact that public opinion strongly favored Simmons. Not wanting to alienate the fan base even more, Gussie caved. Before the 1973 season got underway, Simmons signed a 2-year deal worth $70,000, the exact yearly salary Simmons had requested the previous season. His performance forced the Cardinals to reevaluate their stance, and ultimately led to a new contract worth $70,000 over 2 years. The $35,000 per season was the amount he had initially requested. When asked for comment, Busch offered up what may be the lamest excuse in the history of lame excuses. He stated he had wanted the club to operate within the spirit of President Nixon's wage price guidelines and had waited until the U.S. Pay Board announced that professional athletes were exempt from wage control before they addressed Simmons' demands. Simmons' ability to block out the distractions and have a great season not only validated his decision to hold out, but also showed other players that the real power rested with them and not the owners. His bold stand set a precedent for future generations of MLB players who are still reaping the benefits to this day. While Ted's holdout did not directly challenge the reserve clause, that would come in 1975 with his teammate Curt Flood taking his case to the Supreme Court and the site's decision. It showed the growing willingness of players to stand up for their rights. Simmons's actions demonstrated that players were no longer willing to accept the status quo and that they, and not the owners, had the leverage to demand equitable treatment. In the years following Simmons' holdout, the Major League Baseball Players Association, MLBPA, grew increasingly powerful under the leadership of Executive Director Marvin Miller. The union's efforts paid off with the 1975 ruling that effectively ended the reserve clause. It effectively granted players the right to negotiate with multiple teams after a certain period of service. This seismic shift in labor relations would not have been possible without the courage and determination of players like Simmons, who paved the way for change. Although the system wouldn't truly change for 3 more years, Ted's decision to play the 1972 season without a contract lit the fuse to a bomb that would ultimately explode the reserve clause and give players the same rights as millions of other workers who didn't play professional sports. The genie of a new era of player empowerment was officially out of the bottle, and there was no putting him back. Off the field, Simmons was known to be an outside-of-the-box type of thinker. He read everything he could get his hands on, and his interests and passions outside of baseball were numerous. That type of unconventional thinking is credited for giving Simmons the willingness to challenge conventional thinking and protest the status quo. But it wasn't just baseball that was undergoing changes in the 1970s. It was a decade of upheaval and transformation in the United States. Movements that had begun in the 60s, like the demand for civil rights, women's rights, and workers' rights, came to a head in the 70s, with significant changes occurring on all 3 fronts. You can make the case that Simmons' stand against the Cardinals can be seen as part of a larger struggle for fairness and equity by groups that had previously suffered discrimination and oppression in one way or another. The impact of Simmons' actions still reverberates today. Players in all sports benefit from a system that allows them to negotiate their contracts and seek the best possible deals, a reality that was hard-won through the efforts of pioneers like Simmons. While labor disputes continue to plague professional sports, the balance of power has shifted significantly since the days of the reserve clause, thanks in large part to the courage and determination of players who refused to accept the status quo. Today, Simmons' legacy is remembered not only for his accomplishments on the field, but also for his role in shaping the modern landscape of professional sports and, since 2022, college sports as well. His courage and determination continue to inspire players and fans alike, serving as a reminder that progress almost always requires bold action and unwavering belief in your cause. What about you? Would you be willing to play a year without a contract, risking your livelihood, because you were willing to stand up for what you knew in your heart? Let us know in the comments section. And now that we've talked about Ted's impact on future generations, let's take a look at the career of this underappreciated superstar. Ted Lyle Simmons was born on August 9, 1949, in Highland Park, Michigan, the last of 4 children of William Bill Finnis and Bonnie Sue Webb Simmons. He grew up in Southfield, a suburb on Detroit's northwest side, where his father's job as a trainer for harness racing horses afforded the family a stable middle-class lifestyle. Under the tutelage of his 2 older brothers, the right-handed throwing, yet natural left-handed hitting, Ted began playing organized Little League ball by the time he was 9 years old at East Southfield School. His brother Jim, who was 15 years older than Ted, encouraged him to become a switch hitter at the age of 13. Jim and his brother Ned spent hours playing ball with the youngster and teaching him the intricacies of the game. At Southfield High School, the 6'1" Simmons emerged as one of the best all-around athletes in the Detroit metropolitan area. Being quick, strong, and agile enabled him to excel not just at baseball, but also on the hardwood court and the gridiron, where he was a point guard and star halfback, respectively. He scored 14 touchdowns in his junior season and followed it up with 15 TDs as a senior. He was named to the Detroit area All-Star team and 3rd team All-State in his final season. His baseball and football coach, Ed Bryant, called him the best athlete I have ever seen. Although he was heavily recruited and purportedly received scholarship offers to play football at the University of Michigan, Ohio State University, Purdue University, and the University of Colorado, among others, baseball was his true passion. That wasn't a totally unexpected move, since big league scouts had had Ted on their radar since his junior year at Southfield. After his junior year, Simmons helped lead the A and B brokers to the title in the Class D Detroit Amateur Baseball Federation and then to the National Amateur Baseball Federation championship. Believing they had found a unicorn in the switch-hitting Simmons, every game he played in his senior year was attended by at least 8 to 10 scouts, and Ted gave them their money's worth, hitting .490 on the year. Even though he was a likely first-round pick, Ted let it be known that he intended to attend the University of Michigan on a baseball scholarship. But teams weren't ready to give up that easily, and Ted was selected with the 10th pick of the first round by the St. Louis Cardinals. Simmons was initially upset about being picked by the Cards since they already had the 25-year-old Tim McCarver behind the plate. But the $50,000 signing bonus St. Louis offered went a long way toward making those concerns take a back seat. And on July 9, 1967, Ted, who wouldn't turn 18 for another month, reported to rookie camp in Florida. After playing just 6 games in the Gulf Coast League, the Cardinals brass had seen enough, and they quickly promoted him to the St. Louis Class A team in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. There, Ted found himself challenged for the first time in his life, and he hit just .269. Simmons attended college at the University of Michigan in the offseason, and his school requirements limited him to only a few days of spring training. In 2008, the Cardinals minor league camp in 1968. Back in Class A, Simmons tore up the California League with Modesto, leading the circuit in batting average and RBIs. To no one's surprise, Simmons was named the league's MVP. In September, the Cardinals called him up to the big leagues, but Ted, whose family had always stressed the importance of an education, was still attending college at Michigan and only played big league games on the weekend. That's pretty mind-boggling. Hey, Ted, we have a big series starting on Friday. Any way you could make it? Gee, I'd like to, but I've got a big Western Civ test on Friday, and it's 40% of my grade. How does Saturday work for you? He ultimately made his major league debut on September 21st, starting at catcher and singling in his second at-bat against Claude Osteen of the Dodgers in Los Angeles. After another short spring camp, Simmons was on the fast track to the majors and was assigned to Tulsa in the AAA American Association in 1969. As he had done since he was 7, he excelled with the bat, hitting .317 with 16 home runs and 88 RBIs. He was named catcher on the American Association AAA All-Star team. But while Ted's bat was ready for prime time, his catching skills were more like watching Saturday morning cartoons. He spent countless hours with minor league coach and former Cardinals player Mike Ryba. It was an arduous process, but Simmons gradually improved his footwork, proper shifting, balance, and throwing techniques. But his bat was just fine, and in another September call-up, Simmons, in his first start on September 18th in St. Louis, laced a 2-out run-scoring single to drive in Curt Flood for a dramatic 8-7 victory over the Pittsburgh Pirates. He provided the fireworks again 2 weeks later, belting a 2-out triple to drive in Joe Torre for another walk-off victory, 6-5, against the Philadelphia Phillies. But 1969 was not a great year for the Cardinals, who, after 2 consecutive NL pennants, dropped to 4th in the National League East, the first year of divisional play. After the season, St. Louis general manager Bing Devine pulled the trigger on a blockbuster trade that would have a major impact on Ted, the Cardinals, and the institution of Major League Baseball. The Cards traded McCarver, outfielder Curt Flood, reliever Joe Herner, and journeyman Byron Brown to the Phillies for the perennially upset Richie Allen, infielder Cookie Rojas, and pitcher Jerry Johnson. Flood refused to report the Phillies and subsequently challenged the legality of baseball's reserve clause. The decision in his case would eventually usher in free agency and the right of players to negotiate with any team they wanted after a certain amount of time in the league. To make room for Allen, the Cardinals planned to move former catcher and regular first baseman Joe Torre to third base, and the veteran agreed to hone his skills at the Florida Instructional League that fall. However, the Cardinals' master plan fell apart when Simmons was called for a 6-month tour in the Army Reserve beginning in December. After his hitch was up in May 1970, Simmons reported to AAA Tulsa and proved to the world that despite being in the Army for the last 6 months, he still remembered how to hit. After putting up a .373 average in Oklahoma, Ted was called up to the bigs after just 15 games. At just 20 years old, Ted had played his last game in the minor leagues. Simmons made his first start on May 30th and never looked back. On June 7th, he belted his first home run, connecting off the San Diego Padres' Roberto Rodriguez for a 2-run shot in the Cardinals' victory at Busch Stadium. That year was anything but smooth for Simmons and the Cardinals. The Birds had their worst finish since 1959, and Simmons at times seemed overwhelmed by big league pitchers. His batting average plummeted, and he finished the season hitting just .243. But despite his struggles at the plate, he was still a menace behind it, allowing 15 passed balls, second most in the NL, in just 74 games. When I came up, I didn't have time to know what a catcher does, Simmons later said. Enter former Redbird third All-Star catcher Hal Smith, who served as Simmons's personal tutor, instructing him on basic fundamentals, strengthening his arm and throws to first and second, and developing better balance and agility. After making a small tweak in his batting stance, Simmons emerged as one of baseball's biggest early season surprises in 1971. He started 16 of the first 17 games of the season and absolutely raked, hitting .400 for the first 2 weeks of the season. He finished the season with a .304 batting average and 77 RBIs, both of which were second best among catchers in the majors behind the Pittsburgh Pirates' Manny Sanguignan. That would begin a pattern where Simmons, despite some eye-popping offensive stats, was always overshadowed by another catcher who turned in an even more impressive offensive season. This time it was Sanguillen, but later would come Carlton Fisk, Thurman Munson, Gary Carter, as well as Ted's personal roadblock, Cincinnati catcher Johnny Bench. Led by Simmons and 71 NL MVP Torre, the Cardinals made a run at the eventual NL East champion Pirates, coming as close as 3.5 games on August 15, but finished runner-up. On August 14th of that season, Ted would catch Bob Gibson's first and only no-hitter in an 11-0 beatdown of the Pirates. Simmons contributed in a big way, smacking 4 hits and scoring 3 times, culminating a torrid 9-game streak when he collected 17 hits and 38 at-bats. 1972 was the season Ted played without a contract, and his treatment played no small part in the player's decision to go on strike for the first time in MLB history. 86 games over 13 days were canceled and not made up before they reached an uneasy truce. It was another lost season for the Cardinals, who finished in 4th place again. Their biggest offensive weapon was Simmons, who hit over 300 again and set team records for home runs, RBIs, and hits as a catcher. Simmons' 10 full seasons with the Cardinals were remarkably consistent. He was almost always the team's most dangerous offensive weapon, leading it in home runs 5 times and the runner-up 3 times, while the team finished last or next to last in the league in round trippers 6 times. He led the Cardinals in RBIs 7 times, runner-up 2 times, batted 300-plus 6 times, and earned 6 All-Star berths. He was an Iron Man behind the plate, catching an average of 135 games per season over those 10 years, more than any catcher in the big leagues. He also led the NL in games played as a catcher 3 times. During that decade-long span, Simmons collected more hits than anyone in baseball, except for Rod Carew, Pete Rose, Al Oliver, and Steve Garvey. He also drove in more runs than anyone but Reggie Jackson, Bench, and Tony Perez. He hit for a higher average than any catcher in baseball, and also had the second most home runs among catchers, behind only Bench. For good measure, he also set a new record for most home runs as a switch hitter in the NL, breaking Pete Rose's mark. After the 1980 season, Whitey Herzog was hired as the new manager, and he decided he wanted to build the Cards around defense and speed. After bringing in catcher Darrell Porter, who had been his catcher when he managed the Kansas City Royals, the writing was on the wall, and just 5 days after Porter's signing, the Cardinals executed one of the biggest blockbuster deals in club history, sending Simmons perennial all-star reliever Raleigh Fingers, whom they had also acquired during the winter meetings in a 12-player trade with the San Diego Padres, and right-hander Pete Vukovich to the Milwaukee Brewers in exchange for workhorse right-hander Larry Sorensen, right fielder Sixto Lescano, and 2 prospects, pitcher Dave LaPointe and outfielder David Green. Simmons had some leverage, though, as a 10-5 man, 10 years in the majors and the last 5 with the same club, and had to agree to the trade, which he did when the Brewers paid him an estimated $750,000 to accept the deal. That year, he played without a contract really paid off for Ted. Unlike the Punch and Judy Cardinals, the Brew Crew had led the majors with 203 home runs in 1980, paced by Ben Oglivie, who tied Reggie Jackson for the AL lead, and the 79 home run champ, Gorman Thomas. True to form, Simmons blasted a 2-run shot against the Cleveland Indians on April 12th in his second game as a Brewer. But that was the high point of the early season, as Ted, who was bothered by a sore shoulder, struggled at the plate and was still hitting below the Mendoza line heading into June. When play resumed, it was decided that the season would be split into 2 halves, with the first half winner taking in the second half winner to determine the division winner. The Brewers finished first in the second half and were slated to play the Yankees in a 5-game playoff. The first time in club history, the Brewers had qualified for the postseason. Milwaukee dropped the first 2 games, but they rallied to take Game 3, 5-3 at Yankee Stadium, behind Simmons's 2-run home run and RBI double. But it wasn't quite enough, and the Yankees took the series in 5 games. 1982 saw another slow start to the season for Ted, and for the first time in his career, he was peppered with boos from Brewers fans at County Stadium. Struggling to play .500 ball, the Brewers fired manager Buck Rogers on June 2nd, and he didn't take it well. Rogers blamed 2 clubhouse cancers for the club's problems. Though he didn't mention names, it was widely understood that he meant Simmons, whose perceived defensive liabilities, offensive meltdown, and outspoken personality grated on the former backstop, with the other being pitcher Mike Caldwell. But things immediately began to look up when the Brewers hired longtime Brewers minor league coach Harvey Quinn to be the new skipper. Harvey was a laid-back guy who famously told his team to just go out there and have fun. They responded to the breath of fresh air by winning 30 of their next 41 games, moving into sole possession of first place on July 15th. It definitely looked like there had been a clubhouse cancer. It just wasn't who Rogers thought it was. Simmons heated up too, collecting 16 hits in his last 35 at-bats and knocking in 11 runs in 9 games to push his batting average to .273 at the end of August. A late-season swoon made the season finale in Baltimore the deciding game in who would win the division. Led by the 1982 MVP Robin Yount's 2 homers and one by Ted, the Brewers exploded for 10 runs and took the divisional crown. After an epic comeback against the Angels, who had won the first 2 games, the Brewers were headed to the World Series. Their opponent would be the St. Louis Cardinals, and the 2 styles couldn't be more different. Harvey's wallbangers, as they were known, led the major league home runs and runs scored, but the Cardinals played whitey ball, a style that stressed speed, stolen bases, small ball, and defense. After erupting for 10 runs in Game 1, it looked like the rout was on. Simmons hit a solo shot in that game and added another in Game 2 but he managed only 1 more hit in the final 5 games as the Cardinals won Game 7 at Busch Stadium. In 1983, Simmons split his time behind the plate and as the DH and responded by batting .308, knocking in a career-best 108 runs and earning his final All-Star section, while the Brewers won 87 games, yet finished in 5th place in the cutthroat AL East. On June 12th, Simmons doubled in the 10th inning against the Yankees in County Stadium to reach the 2,000 hit plateau. He parlayed his successful season into a lucrative 3-year, $3 million contract. But the toll of catching over 1,700 games was starting to catch up with Simmons, and he had 2 forgettable seasons as the Brewers languished in the standings. After being traded to the Atlanta Braves in March 1986, Simmons spent his final 3 seasons playing sparingly behind the plate and at first and third base. As a veteran presence on a struggling young team, Simmons was basically a player-coach, helping the young players adjust to the major leagues. Finally, after 2,456 games, the 38-year-old Simmons retired following the 1988 season. He wouldn't be away from the game for long, though, and after he returned to his offseason in St. Louis, he soon accepted a job as the Cardinals' director of players personnel. This would kick off his second career, and he spent the next 3 decades as a baseball executive. Simmons was unquestionably one of the most productive hitting catchers in Major League history. He currently ranks 16th with 1,771, 29 more than bench, and his 2,472 hits ranks second all-time as of 2019 behind only Hall of Fame famer Ivan Rodriguez. And his 1,389 RBIs, 13 more than bench, ranks second only to Yogi Berra. He hit 300 plus 7 times, knocked in at least 90 runs 8 times, and finished in the top 10 in each category 5 times from 1971 to 1980. 6 times in doubles and 3 times in total hits. Sounds like a shoo-in for a first-vote Hall of Famer, right? Not exactly. In fact, in his first year of eligibility, he received just 3.7% of the vote, a shameful total and one that failed to meet the 5% threshold to remain on the ballot in subsequent seasons. But good things come to those who wait, and in December 2019, Simmons finally received enough votes from the Veterans Committee to open the doors of Cooperstown. Of course, with the pandemic descending on the world just a couple of months later, Ted would have to wait another year for the official induction ceremony. There's never too long a time to wait if you finally make the leap, Simmons told St. Louis Post-Dispatch sports writer Rick Hummel upon learning the news. And today I finally did. Ted Simmons was one of the best hitting catchers of all time, and he finally received the recognition he deserved. He was also inducted into the Missouri and Michigan Sports Hall of Fame, which recognized the one-of-a-kind contributions he made as a player and as a human being. The guy who always seemed to be overshadowed by another catcher during his playing days finally got the recognition he richly deserved. Thanks for watching, and we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a comment and let us know if you remember Ted's time with the Cards or Brewers. Maybe you got to see him in Atlanta at the tail end of his career. But even if you just saw him on TV, leave a comment and let us know your thoughts.